People always ask me how I survived 25 days alone on that island. They want to know about the hunger, the thirst, the fear. But what they really want to know is how I watched my husband of 12 years disappear beneath those black waves, how I had to choose between saving him or saving myself. They want to know how a person keeps breathing when everything inside them has died. I'm going to tell you that story. Every brutal, heartbreaking detail of it. Because maybe somewhere in my nightmare, there's something that'll help someone else survive theirs. Or maybe I just need to get it out before it kills what's left of me. It started as the most perfect day we'd had in months. March 15th, 2019. I remember the date because it was our anniversary, not our wedding anniversary, but the anniversary of our first date. David always remembered those little things. He'd wake up and say something like, "You know what today is?" with that crooked grin of his. That morning was no different. 12 years since you finally said yes to coffee with me, he said, bringing me a cup while I was still in bed. The steam curled up between us, and I could see those green eyes of his sparkling with mischief. I didn't finally say yes, I protested, the same argument we'd had 100 times. You asked me out while I was ordering a sandwich. I was distracted. And thank God for that sandwich, he laughed, kissing my forehead. We'd been going through a rough patch. Not anything dramatic, just life wearing us down. David had been laid off from the construction company 6 months earlier, and I was pulling double shifts at the hospital trying to keep us afloat. We barely saw each other anymore, and when we did, we were too exhausted to really connect. But that morning felt different. Lighter somehow. I have an idea, David said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Remember that little fishing boat we looked at last month? The one for sale down at the marina? I nodded. We'd walked past it during one of our rare dates, and David had stopped to admire it. It was this tiny thing, barely big enough for 2 people, painted white with blue trim. The owner wanted $3,000 for it, money we definitely didn't have. Well, I called the guy yesterday. He said we could take it out for a test run. See if it's worth saving up for. The way his face lit up when he talked about that boat, God, I hadn't seen him that excited about anything in months. How could I say no? You mean go out on the ocean? David, neither of us knows the first thing about boat fishing. Come on, Sarah. When's the last time we did something spontaneous? Something just for us? He was right. Between work and bills and just trying to survive, we'd forgotten how to have fun together. I looked at his face, really looked at it, and saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Not the stressed, defeated version that had been living in our house, but the David who used to surprise me with midnight drives and picnics in the rain. Okay, I said. But if we die out there, I'm blaming you. He laughed and pulled me into this huge bear hug. We're not going to die, babe. We're going to have the best day ever. The marina was about a 40-minute drive from our house. I spent the whole ride asking practical questions. Did we have life jackets? Did David know how to start the engine? What if the weather turned bad? He kept reassuring me, pointing out that it was supposed to be calm and sunny all day. And it was beautiful. Not a cloud in the sky, barely any wind. The ocean looked like glass stretching out to the horizon. The boat owner, an older guy named Pete, spent about an hour showing David the basics. How to start the engine, how to read the simple instruments, where the safety equipment was stored. I was taking mental notes of everything, but honestly, most of it went over my head. She's a good little boat, Pete said, patting the side like it was a loyal dog. Been taking care of me for 15 years. Just don't go out too far on your first time. Stay within sight of shore, and keep an eye on the weather. Ocean can change fast. We promised we would be careful. David helped me into the boat, I was wearing my favorite sundress, not exactly fishing attire, but I figured we were just testing it out. We packed a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, threw in a couple of basic fishing rods Pete let us borrow, and headed out. The first hour was magical. Just magical. The boat puttered along at a gentle pace, and I sat in the front with my face turned up to the sun. David was behind me, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching forward to touch my shoulder every few minutes. We weren't talking much, just enjoying the peace of it all. "Look at that," David said, pointing to our left. A group of dolphins was swimming alongside us, jumping and diving like they were putting on a show just for us. I grabbed his phone and started taking pictures, laughing as they seemed to pose for the camera. "This is incredible," I shouted over the engine noise. "Why don't we do this more often?" "Because we're idiots who forgot how to live," he shouted back, grinning. We found a spot about 2 miles from shore where Pete had suggested the fishing might be good. David cut the engine, and suddenly we were floating in this perfect bubble of silence. Just the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the distant cry of seagulls. Neither of us caught anything, but we didn't care. We ate our sandwiches and talked about everything and nothing. David told me about this job interview he had lined up for next week, something he'd been too nervous to mention before. I told him about Mrs. Patterson in room 314, who'd been asking about him every time I worked her shift. "She thinks you're too skinny," I said, unwrapping a second sandwich and handing it to him. "Mrs. Patterson thinks everyone's too skinny. She tried to give me her dinner roll last time I visited. It felt like we were dating again. Like we were just Sarah and David, not Sarah and David who can't pay their bills, and David and Sarah who barely talk anymore." Around 3 o'clock, David suggested we head back. "Don't want to worry Pete," he said, starting up the engine. "Plus, I promised you dinner at that Italian place you like." I was sitting facing him as he steered us back toward shore, and I remember thinking how handsome he looked with the sun on his face and the wind in his hair. 12 years together, and my heart still did this little skip when he smiled at me. That's when I noticed the clouds. They weren't there before, I'm sure of it. But now there was this dark line on the horizon behind us, like someone had drawn it across the sky with a black marker. "David," I said, pointing. "Look." He turned to see what I was looking at, and his smile faded. "Okay," he said, his voice suddenly all business. "That came up fast. But we're fine. We're only about 20 minutes from the marina." But even as he said it, I could see him pushing the throttle forward, making the little engine work harder. The boat started bouncing a bit as we hit the wake from a larger vessel that had passed by earlier. That's when everything changed. The wind hit us first, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had turned on a giant fan. 1 second we were cruising along peacefully, the next second I was gripping the sides of the boat as it started rocking violently. "Hold on," David yelled, but his voice was already being swallowed by the wind. I looked back at those clouds, and they weren't on the horizon anymore. They were right on top of us, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen in nature. The temperature dropped what felt like 20 degrees in seconds. The first drops of rain felt like ice against my skin. "David, we need to get back now," I screamed, but he was already doing everything he could. The little engine was whining as he pushed it to its limit. That's when the waves started. Not big waves at first, just enough to make the boat pitch and roll in a way that made my stomach lurch. But they were growing. Fast. I watched the shore getting closer, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. The rain was coming down harder now, stinging my face and making it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. David was hunched over the wheel, water streaming down his face, shouting something I couldn't hear over the roar of wind and rain. A wave bigger than the rest hit us broadside, and the boat tilted so far I thought we were going over. Water poured over the side, soaking us both and pulling around our feet. That's when I saw the real terror in David's eyes. "Sarah," he yelled, grabbing my hand. "I need you to put on a life jacket. Now." The life jackets were in a compartment near my feet, but every time I tried to reach for them, another wave would slam into us and I'd have to grab hold of something to keep from being thrown overboard. The engine sputtered. Died. Started again. Died for good. And suddenly we were just floating. No, not floating, we were being tossed around like a toy in a bathtub, completely at the mercy of waves that seemed to be growing by the second. That's when I realized we might actually die out there. And that was just the beginning. The silence after the engine died was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. Not actual silence, the storm was roaring around us like a freight train, but the absence of that steady puttering that had been our lifeline back to shore. David was frantically trying to restart it, pulling the cord over and over while water crashed over the sides of our little boat. His knuckles were white from gripping so hard, and I could see the panic starting to take hold in his eyes. Come on," he was muttering, yanking that cord like his life depended on it. Which, I guess, it did. I finally managed to grab the life jackets from the compartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the buckles. The boat was tilting at crazy angles with each wave, and I kept getting thrown against the sides. My sundress was completely soaked and clinging to me, making everything harder. "Here," I screamed, trying to hand David his life jacket, but he waved me off. "I need to get this started first," he yelled back, still pulling that damn cord. That's when the biggest wave yet came out of nowhere. I saw it coming, this wall of dark water taller than our boat, rolling toward us like something out of a movie. Time slowed down in that weird way it does when you know something terrible is about to happen. "David!" I screamed, pointing. He looked up just as it hit us. The world turned upside down. Literally. One second I was sitting in the boat looking at my husband, the next second I was underwater, spinning, not knowing which way was up. The water was so cold it felt like knives against my skin, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but panic. My life jacket pulled me to the surface, and I came up gasping and choking on seawater. The rain was hitting my face so hard I could barely keep my eyes open, but I was desperately looking around for David. 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 The boat was about 10 feet away from me, upside down, its white bottom reflecting the gray sky. I could see one of our sandwiches floating nearby, and David's phone bobbing in the waves. But no David. David. Where are you? I tried to swim toward the overturned boat, but the waves kept pushing me away. Every time I'd make a little progress, another surge would carry me backward. The life jacket was keeping me afloat, but it was also making it hard to move my arms properly. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, David coughing. He came up on the other side of the boat, spitting out water and looking as terrified as I felt. But he was alive. He was breathing. "Sarah. Are you okay?" "I'm okay. Are you hurt?" He shook his head and started swimming toward me, fighting the same waves I was fighting. It took him forever to reach me, both of us getting pushed around like we weighed nothing. When he finally got close enough, he grabbed my hand and held on tight. "We need to get to the boat," he yelled. "Try to flip it back over." We both knew that was probably impossible. The boat had to weigh at least 1,000 pounds, and we were just two people treading water in a storm. But what else could we do? We struggled over to it together, getting battered by waves the whole way. David dove under a few times, trying to see if he could push it from underneath, but it was no use. The thing was like a cork, it wanted to stay upside down. "It's not working," he gasped, coming up for air. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. "David, look." The shore was gone. I mean, completely gone. Where there had been a clear view of land just minutes before, now there was nothing but gray water and gray sky meeting somewhere in the distance. The storm had pushed us so far out that I couldn't even tell which direction land was supposed to be. I saw the exact moment this realization hit David too. His face went pale, and he looked around frantically, spinning in the water like maybe he'd missed something. "It has to be there," he said, more to himself than to me. We were only 2 miles out. "It has to be there." But it wasn't. We held onto the side of the overturned boat and tried to think. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and the waves seemed to be getting bigger, not smaller. Every few minutes, one would break right over our heads, forcing us underwater and making us lose our grip. "Okay," David said, and I could hear him trying to sound calm and rational. "Okay. Someone will notice we're missing. Pete knows we took the boat out. He'll call the Coast Guard." I nodded, wanting to believe him. But Pete had said we could keep the boat all day if we wanted. He might not expect us back until evening. And even if he did call someone, how would they find us in this storm? We didn't have flares or a radio or any way to signal for help. My wedding ring slipped off my finger. I don't know why that detail stuck with me, but I watched it sink into the dark water and felt like I was watching my whole life disappear. 12 years of marriage, gone in a second. "We need to swim," David said suddenly. "What?" "We can't stay here. The storm's pushing us further out. We need to try to swim back toward shore." I looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "David, we don't even know which way shore is. And in these waves? Then what do you want to do? Just float here until we drown?" He was right, but he was also wrong. Swimming in conditions like this was basically suicide. But so was staying put. That's when we saw it, a dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the rain and spray. "Is that land?" I screamed. David squinted, trying to make it out. "I think so. It looks like, maybe an island?" It was hard to tell how far away it was or even if it was real. It could have been a cloud or just our eyes playing tricks on us. But it was something to swim toward, which was more than we'd had a minute ago. "We can make it," David said, and I could hear him trying to convince himself as much as me. "It's not that far. We just have to stay together." We left the boat. I'll never forget that moment, letting go of the only solid thing in our world and trusting ourselves to the ocean. It felt like jumping off a cliff. The swimming was a nightmare. We'd make a little progress, then a wave would hit us and push us backward. The life jackets helped keep us afloat, but they also made us clumsy in the water. My sundress kept tangling around my legs, and I finally had to take it off and swim in just my underwear and life jacket. David stayed next to me the whole time, encouraging me when I wanted to give up, grabbing my hand when the waves separated us. I don't know how long we were in the water, maybe an hour, maybe 3. Time didn't mean anything anymore. But slowly, gradually, that dark shape started looking more like land. Like actual, real land with rocks and what might have been trees. "We're going to make it," David kept saying. "We're almost there, baby. Just a little further." My arms felt like lead, and I was swallowing seawater with every breath, but I kept swimming. We kept swimming. The waves were actually helping us now, pushing us toward the island instead of away from it. I could see where the water was breaking against rocks, white foam churning in the dark. "Be careful," David yelled. "Don't let the waves push you into the rocks." But I was so exhausted I could barely control where I was going. The current was stronger near the island, pulling us toward a section of rocky shore that looked like it would tear us apart. That's when David made the decision that saved my life and cost him his. he grabbed me and pushed me toward a small strip of what looked like sand between two rock formations. "Swim there," he screamed. "Get to the beach." I tried to swim toward it, but I was fighting the current and losing. David came up behind me and started pushing, using his own body to guide me away from the rocks. I felt my feet touch bottom, actual sand beneath my feet, and I've never been so grateful for anything in my life. I crawled up onto the beach on my hands and knees, coughing up seawater and shaking uncontrollably. When I turned around to help David, he wasn't there. The last wave that had pushed me to safety had pulled him back out. I could see him about 20 yards from shore, fighting against a current that was carrying him toward the rocks. "David." He looked at me one last time, and I saw him mouth the words "I love you." Then the ocean took him. And I was alone. I don't remember how long I sat on that beach screaming David's name. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Time stopped making sense the moment I watched him disappear beneath those waves. I kept thinking he'd surface again. That he'd come up gasping and fighting like he had when the boat first flipped. I stared at that churning water until my eyes burned, willing him to appear, making deals with God I knew I couldn't keep. "Please," I was saying out loud, over and over. "Please, please, please." But the ocean just kept rolling in and out, indifferent to my begging. The storm was starting to calm down, which somehow made everything worse. When the wind and rain were screaming around me, I could barely think. But as it got quieter, the reality of what had happened started sinking in. David was gone. My husband of 12 years was gone, and I was alone on some tiny island in the middle of nowhere. I was sitting in the sand in my underwear and a life jacket, shivering so hard my teeth were chattering like castanets. The temperature had dropped with the storm, and my skin was turning blue. I needed to find shelter, find fresh water, find food. I needed to figure out how to survive. But I couldn't move. I just sat there staring at the waves, hoping against hope that David would somehow swim back to me. It was getting dark when I finally forced myself to stand up. My legs were shaky, partly from exhaustion, partly from shock. I looked around the island for the first time, really looked at it. It was small. Maybe a couple 100 yards long and half that wide. Rocky on 3 sides with this one little stretch of sandy beach where I'd washed up. There were some scrubby trees and bushes scattered around, and what looked like a hill in the center. No buildings. No boats. No people. No signs that anyone had ever been here before. I was completely alone. The life jacket was weighing me down and making me colder, so I took it off and dropped it on the sand. Standing there in just my bra and underwear, I felt more vulnerable than I'd ever felt in my life. Like I'd been stripped of everything that made me human and left with nothing but the animal need to survive. I needed clothes. I needed warmth. I needed shelter. The beach had debris scattered all over it, pieces of wood, plastic bottles, rope, all kinds of junk that had washed up over the years. I started gathering anything that looked useful, my hands still shaking from cold and shock. There was a plastic tarp tangled up in some seaweed. It was torn and dirty, but it was something. I found a couple of pieces of driftwood that I could use as poles. Some rope that was frayed but still strong enough to tie things together. Building a shelter sounds simple when you're watching survival shows on TV. In reality, when you're half naked and traumatized and working with garbage, it's nearly impossible. I tried to make a lean-to against some rocks, but the wind kept blowing it down. I tried to tie the tarp between 2 trees, but I couldn't get the knots tight enough. Every time I thought I had something that might work, it would collapse or blow away. By the time full darkness fell, I had managed to create what could generously be called a tent. It was basically the tarp stretched over some driftwood, anchored down with rocks. It was barely big enough for me to crawl into, and it looked like it would fall apart if someone sneezed on it. But it was something. It was shelter. I crawled inside and curled up in a ball, trying to conserve body heat. The sand was still damp from the storm, and it was cold against my skin. I could hear the ocean just a few yards away, the waves hitting the beach in a rhythm that should have been soothing but just reminded me of how David had vanished beneath them. That's when I started crying. Really crying, for the first time since it happened. I cried for David, for the life we'd been building together, for all the plans we'd made that would never happen now. I cried for myself, stranded on this godforsaken rock with no idea if anyone would ever find me. I cried until my chest hurt and my eyes were swollen shut. The crying helped, in a weird way. It was like letting some of the pressure out of a kettle before it exploded. When I was done, I felt hollow but a little clearer. David was gone, and crying wasn't going to bring him back. But I was alive, and if I wanted to stay that way, I needed to start thinking practically. First priority, fresh water. I could survive for weeks without food if I had to, but 3 days without water would kill me. I'd seen some puddles of rainwater collected in rocks during my search for shelter materials. Tomorrow, I'd need to find them again and see if any of the water was drinkable. I'd also need to figure out how to collect and store more water when it rained again. Second priority, food. The island was too small to have any large animals, but maybe there were fish in the shallow water, or crabs, or some kind of edible plants. I didn't know anything about foraging or fishing without proper equipment, but I'd have to learn fast. Third priority, signaling for rescue. Somebody had to be looking for us by now. Pete would have noticed we didn't bring the boat back. My supervisor at the hospital would wonder why I didn't show up for my shift tomorrow. David's mom called us every Sunday. When we didn't answer, she'd know something was wrong. I needed to make myself visible from the air or from the water. Build a signal fire, spell out SOS with rocks on the beach, anything that might catch the attention of search planes or boats. These thoughts were giving me something to focus on besides my grief. Having a plan, even a rough one, made me feel slightly less helpless. But then the sounds started. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees. But as I listened more carefully, I realized there were animals on this island. Not big ones, the scurrying and rustling sounded like small creatures moving through the underbrush. Rats, maybe. Or lizards. Possibly snakes. The thought of snakes made my skin crawl. What if there were poisonous ones? What if I stepped on one in the dark? What if one crawled into my pathetic excuse for a shelter while I was sleeping? Every little sound made me jump. A stick breaking somewhere in the darkness. Something small splashing in a tide pool. The wind making the tarp flap like a bird trying to escape. I don't think I slept at all that first night. I just lay there in the dark, listening to the island's nighttime symphony and trying not to think about David floating somewhere out there in the black water. When the sun finally started to rise, I crawled out of my shelter feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My whole body ached from lying on the hard, damp sand. My lips were cracked from salt water and dehydration. My skin was burned from yesterday's sun and wind. But I was alive. Standing on that beach in the early morning light, looking out at the endless ocean, I made myself a promise. I was going to survive this. I was going to get off this island and go home and tell everyone about David, what a hero he'd been, how he'd saved my life. I owed him that much. The question was, how long would I have to wait? As it turned out, a lot longer than I ever could have imagined. By the 10th day, I was talking to David like he was sitting right next to me. "What do you think about these berries?" I'd ask, holding up a handful of small red things I'd found growing on a bush near the center of the island. "They look okay to you? Not too poisonous?" Of course, he never answered. But in my head, I could hear his voice clear as day telling me to be careful, to try just one first and see what happened. I was losing my mind. I knew I was losing my mind. But somehow, having these conversations with my dead husband was the only thing keeping me sane. The first week had been all about basic survival. Finding water, there were several small pools caught in the rocks that filled up when it rained. Building a better shelter, I'd managed to reinforce my tarp tent with more driftwood and seaweed. Figuring out what I could eat without poisoning myself. The island wasn't completely barren. There were those red berries, which turned out to be safe after I spent 2 terrifying days waiting to see if they'd kill me. Some kind of edible seaweed that tasted like salty rubber but filled my stomach. Small crabs I could catch in the tide pools if I was patient and quick. But by the second week, the physical challenges weren't the worst part anymore. It was the silence. The endless, crushing silence of being the only human being in my entire world. I'd built a signal fire on the highest point of the island using driftwood and anything else that would burn. I kept it going day and night, feeding it constantly, sending up smoke that I prayed someone would see. I'd spelled out SOS in big letters using white rocks on the dark sand of the beach. Nothing. No planes, no boats, no signs that anyone was even looking for me. That's when the doubt started creeping in. What if nobody had reported us missing? What if Pete thought we decided to keep the boat and sail somewhere else? What if my supervisor at the hospital just assumed I'd quit without notice? It wouldn't be the first time someone had done that. What if nobody was coming because nobody knew I was gone? They're looking, I'd tell David during our one-sided conversations. My mom will call when I don't show up for Sunday dinner. Your mom will worry when we don't answer the phone. But what if they didn't? What if everyone just assumed we'd taken off together, started over somewhere new? We'd been having problems before this trip. Maybe people would think we decided to disappear. On day 12, I saw a plane. I was collecting seaweed for dinner when I heard the engine, that distant droning sound that made my heart jump into my throat. I dropped everything and ran to my signal fire, throwing on every piece of dry wood I had. The smoke billowed up thick and black against the blue sky. Here! I screamed, waving my arms frantically. I'm here. Help me. The plane was just a tiny speck, but it seemed to be getting closer. I kept feeding the fire, kept waving, kept screaming until my voice was raw. For about 10 minutes, I thought I was saved. I was already imagining the rescue boat, the Coast Guard helicopter, the phone call to tell my family I was alive. Then the plane turned and flew away. I watched it disappear over the horizon, taking all my hope with it. That night was the worst yet. I lay in my shelter sobbing like a child, cursing God and David and myself for being stupid enough to go out on that boat. I wanted to die. I actually wanted to die rather than spend another day alone on this rock. Why didn't you save yourself? I screamed at the empty air, talking to David like he could hear me. Why did you have to be such a goddamn hero? We could have both made it. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The current that pulled him away from the beach would have killed us both if he hadn't pushed me to safety first. He'd made a choice, and he'd chosen my life over his. The guilt was eating me alive. Why did I deserve to live when he didn't? Why wasn't I the one who got pulled out to sea? David was stronger, smarter, better at fixing things. He would have figured out how to get rescued by now. By day 15, I'd started doing dangerous things. I'd swim out farther than I should, hoping to see something on the horizon but knowing I might not have the strength to get back. I'd eat plants I wasn't sure about, figuring that if they killed me, at least the waiting would be over. I'd climb up on the rocky cliffs during storms, letting the waves crash over me, not really caring if one swept me away. I wasn't trying to kill myself, exactly. But I wasn't trying very hard to stay alive either. That's when I found the cave. I was exploring the far side of the island, the part that was mostly rocks and cliffs, when I noticed a dark opening about halfway up the rocky face. It was partially hidden by some twisted trees, which is why I hadn't seen it before. Getting up there was treacherous. The rocks were slippery and sharp, and one wrong step would have sent me tumbling down to be smashed on the rocks below. But I was past caring about safety. The cave was bigger than it looked from outside, maybe the size of a small bedroom, with a sandy floor and walls that went back into darkness. It was dry, which was more than I could say for my tarp shelter on the beach. But that's not what made me catch my breath. There were things in there. Human things. A plastic water bottle, cracked but still usable. Some rope that was in better shape than the frayed stuff I'd been working with. A rusted knife with half the blade broken off but still sharp enough to cut with. And carved into the wall, barely visible in the dim light, were marks. Tally marks, like someone counting days. I ran my fingers over them, trying to count. There were a lot of them. Way more than 15. Someone else had been here. Someone else had been stranded on this island and had survived long enough to make. I counted again, nearly 200 marks on the wall. Oh my God, I whispered to the empty cave. Someone else made it. But where were they now? Had they been rescued? Had they died here? Had they tried to swim to another island and drowned in the attempt? There was no way to know. But for the first time in days, I felt something other than despair. If someone else had survived here for months, maybe I could too. I decided to move into the cave. It was safer than my beach shelter, drier, and it felt less lonely somehow, knowing that another person had once called it home. That night, I added my own mark to the wall. Day 15. I'm not giving up, I told David as I settled down on the sandy floor. I don't know how long this is going to take, but I'm not giving up. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up again. Another storm was coming. But for the first time since I'd washed up on this godforsaken rock, I felt like I might actually survive it. Day 25. I scratched another mark into the cave wall and stepped back to look at my collection of tiny lines. 3 weeks and 4 days since I'd watched my husband disappear beneath those waves. I was a different person than the woman who'd gone fishing that perfect March morning. My hair was matted with salt and hung past my shoulders in tangled ropes. My skin was dark brown from the sun and covered in scratches and insect bites. I'd lost so much weight that my wedding ring would have fallen right off my finger, if I still had it. But I was alive. And for the first time since the storm, I actually believed I was going to stay that way. Living in the cave had changed everything. It wasn't just the shelter, though being dry and protected from the wind made a huge difference. It was the knowledge that someone else had survived here before me. Those tally marks on the wall had become my inspiration, proof that a human being could endure this and live to tell about it. I'd gotten better at everything. Better at catching crabs, better at predicting when storms were coming, better at finding the plants that wouldn't make me sick. I'd figured out how to make a fishing line from unraveled rope and a hook from a piece of metal I'd found washed up on the beach. Most importantly, I'd made peace with David's death. It took weeks of crying, screaming, and having those one-sided conversations, but I'd finally accepted what had happened. He'd saved my life. He'd made a choice in that terrible moment, and he'd chosen to give me a chance to survive even if it meant he wouldn't. The guilt was still there, it would probably always be there, but it wasn't eating me alive anymore. Instead, it had transformed into something else, determination. I was going to survive because he died to give me that chance. I owed him that much. On the morning of day 25, I was down on the beach checking my crab traps when I heard it. A boat engine. I'd heard engines before, fishing boats passing in the distance, too far away to see my signals. But this one sounded different. Closer. And it seemed to be getting louder instead of fading away. I dropped the crab I'd been holding and ran to my signal fire. The embers were still glowing from the night before, and I threw on every piece of dry wood I had. Smoke started billowing up into the clear morning sky. Then I saw it. A white boat with blue trim, maybe half a mile offshore, moving slowly along the edge of the island. They were looking for something. Looking for me. I ran to the water's edge, waving my arms and screaming at the top of my lungs. Here. I'm here. Help me. The boat kept moving, and for a horrible moment I thought they were going to pass by like all the others. But then it stopped. Turned. Started heading directly toward my little beach. I was jumping up and down in the surf, crying and laughing at the same time. After 25 days of silence, I was about to hear another human voice. The boat had to anchor offshore because of the rocks, but I could see 2 men on board. One of them was shouting something to me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of the waves and my own sobbing. A few minutes later, a smaller inflatable boat was heading toward the beach with one of the men rowing. As it got closer, I could see he was wearing a Coast Guard uniform. Sarah Mitchell, he called out as he pulled the boat up onto the sand. Hearing my own name spoken out loud after weeks of silence hit me like a physical blow. I collapsed to my knees in the surf, unable to speak. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Mitchell? We've been looking for you." I nodded, still unable to find my voice. The Coast Guard officer, his name tag said Rodriguez, knelt down next to me in the water. "We're going to get you out of here, okay? But first, I need to ask, was there anyone else with you? Your husband David?" That's when I broke down completely. All the grief I'd been holding back came pouring out in ugly, wrenching sobs. "He's gone," I managed to choke out. "He saved me, but he's gone." Rodriguez's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We'll keep searching for him. But right now, let's get you safe." The next few hours were a blur of medical checks, warm blankets, and questions I could barely answer. The Coast Guard cutter that picked us up had a small medical bay where a paramedic examined me. Dehydrated, malnourished, covered in cuts and infections, but alive. They gave me water, clean, fresh water that tasted like heaven, and some kind of energy drink that made my empty stomach cramp. They wrapped me in heated blankets and started in 4 to get fluids back into my system. "How did you find me?" I asked Rodriguez when I could finally speak coherently. "Your husband's body washed up on the mainland 3 days ago," he said gently. He still had his wallet in his pocket. That's how we knew to start searching this area. David. They'd found David. There was something else, Rodriguez continued. He had rope tied around his waist. Like he'd been trying to make it back to something. Or someone. Even in death, David had been trying to get back to me. The rope must have been from the boat, something he'd grabbed as he was swept away. He'd been fighting to survive, fighting to get back to me, until the very end. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, baby. Thank you for not giving up." The helicopter that took me to the hospital on the mainland was my first time off the ground in almost a month. Looking down at that tiny island getting smaller and smaller below us, I could barely believe I'd survived there for 25 days. But I had. We had. David and I together, even though he wasn't there for most of it. The doctors said I'd make a full recovery. The physical wounds would heal, and with time and therapy, maybe the emotional ones would too. I'd lost 30 pounds and had enough vitamin deficiencies to fill a medical textbook, but I was alive. The media went crazy for the story. Miracle survivor. 25 days in paradise. Love's ultimate sacrifice. They all wanted to interview the woman who'd survived alone on a deserted island. But they didn't understand what it had really been like. The crushing loneliness, the constant fear, the way I'd had to become someone completely different just to survive. They saw a feel-good survival story. I knew it was really a love story, about a man who'd given everything to save his wife, and a woman who'd found the strength to live because of that gift. I scattered David's ashes in the ocean 6 months later, at the spot where we'd been fishing that perfect day. I told him about the island, about the cave, about how his love had kept me alive even when he couldn't. And I promised him that I'd never forget what he'd done for me. That I'd make the life he'd saved worth saving. Some promises are easier to keep than others. But that one I've kept every single day since.